So what ideas could you offer to us, those of us who are clinicians listening to this interview, who are also doing teaching, training, supervision? What can we do to increase clinicians' use of progress monitoring in their work? What thoughts do you have? I'm sure you've thought about that a lot.
Yeah, I have about it. I think it has to start in grad school. Trainees are not going to get into the habit of monitoring their patients' progress if they're not asked or required to do it in graduate school. And actually, we find trainees are quite open to this methodology. They love to have graphs, and they like to have feedback, and it makes them feel less anxious because they're not in the dark. And the majority of our patients are getting some improvement. So often what they're seeing is the improvement of their patients. And so I would say generally students are eager to have the information, but nobody's teaching it. And so if it starts in grad school, I'm sure it will become a common practice, because it's actually really nice to see a graph. As you know, I mean, when you look at, don't you like your data graph?
Of course I do. I love my data. I do not see how I could do my clinical work without my data. And what you're saying is true. I learned how to do this when I was a practicum student, so I think the idea of getting people started early is very important. It makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, but I think by the time people have practice, 10 years, they're pretty pleased, and they always like going to a workshop where they can get a new idea or a new skill, but really the evidence that those workshops produce better patient outcomes is certainly not proven. But I think it's fun to get together with your peers, and it's fun to see new ideas presented and to adopt them as we wish. But that's not the same as adopting an idea like this that actually has a sort of scientific basis and actually does something we can't do. Like, I know therapists that have used this stuff for years. They don't learn how to predict treatment failure. Just like MDs cannot manage chronic illnesses without blood work. Who wants a physician managing high blood pressure without measuring it? I don't want my MD to use their intuition about what my blood pressure is or my AC1 level. I've got to look at the lab data. So it's that you don't learn anything. So it's not like learning a new intervention skill that you can practice and internalize. This is a methodology that's quite different, because you're actually just practicing relying on lab test data to add something to your clinical judgment that you can't do. Does that make sense?
So, Michael, you're saying something important, but a little bit complicated here. So let me summarize it to see if I've got it. So what you're saying is that clinicians tend to think they don't need to collect feedback from their patients. And you're pointing out that, especially in the case of your tool, the OQ45, which sends a clinicians a signal based on a lot of benchmarking data that you have, that allows clinicians to get information that they otherwise will not have about the probability that their patient is going to fail to recover or may even get worse. What you're saying is clinicians tend to think they don't need to collect feedback because they're doing very well. And you're pointing out that progress monitoring tools, especially the one like yours, are tools that are like lab tests in medicine that provide the clinician with information that otherwise is not available to them. So, for example, the physician doesn't know what my blood pressure is until he measures it. And similarly, clinicians are not necessarily going to know how well their patient is doing unless they measure it and collect the data.
But older clinicians have been practicing for years without it, and I think they're having great outcomes, so they don't want to bother. And it does require a little bit different way of practicing, like it's taking advantage of information technology, computers, the web. So older clinicians, are not always the most up to date. Like people joke, and I'm quite serious. My grandkids are more familiar with using information technology than I am. I'm slow. So partly it's generational. I think we've just not really relied on electronics to improve our clinical practice.
Yes, so these are two impediments. One is that we didn't learn how to do it in graduate school, and it's not so easy to be receptive to learning this kind of thing later in your career. And number two, many of the more senior clinicians, people who are your age and my age, to start using web-based tools to monitor progress, it's not so easy. So I do appreciate that.
And then the third impediment that may be the most important is when in surveys if I pass a survey out to clinicians about how many of their patients benefit from psychotherapy, the average answer is typically about 85%. So we already think we're having great outcomes. If you look at clinical trials that presumably might use the best therapists available who are committed to a therapeutic approach, trained, supervised, and monitored in delivery, and where the clients are not too sick and not too well. So we have the ideal clients that presumably have a disorder. Recovery rates are typically around 60 to 65, depending on the disorder. So we're not having 85% in 14 sessions of a manualized treatment. 65.